You think you know what the universe is because you live inside it. You look around and you see space stretching out in all directions. You see objects sitting in that space, moving through it. You imagine time ticking in the background, quietly keeping score as things happen. Space is the container. Time is the clock. The universe is the stuff inside. That picture feels obvious. It is also almost completely wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being slightly off. Wrong in the sense that it is a mental convenience you inherited, not a structure the universe actually uses. You were taught to think this way because it works well enough for everyday life. It lets you throw balls, build houses, and avoid cliffs. It was never meant to describe reality accurately. Physics does not use that picture. Physics does not start with space as an empty box or time as a ticking background. It starts with measurements, distances between events, durations between events. And when you look closely at those measurements, the picture you were taught begins to fall apart almost immediately. Let's start with space, because that illusion usually goes unnoticed. You think space is just there, empty, passive, a stage where things happen. You imagine that if you removed all matter, all energy, all light, space would remain, stretching endlessly in all directions. Physics does not describe space that way. Space is not an independent backdrop. It is part of the same structure as time, and that structure is not rigid. It bends, it stretches, it curves, not metaphorically, literally, and it does so in response to energy and mass. This is not poetry. This is what gravity is. Gravity is not a force pulling objects through space. That description is already a compromise. Gravity is the geometry of spacetime itself. Objects move the way they do because spacetime tells them how to move. And spacetime curves because objects exist. There is no empty stage underneath. Space is part of the interaction. Now, pause and notice what just happened. The idea of space as a passive container vanished. Space became active, dynamic, responsive. It can no longer be thought of as where things are. It is part of what things are. Time suffers the same fate, but even more brutally. You think time is universal, that everyone, everywhere agrees on how much time has passed, that a second is a second is a second. Physics destroys that belief without apology. Two identical clocks placed in different conditions do not agree. One moves faster. One sits deeper in a gravitational field. One records less time than the other, not because it is broken, because time itself behaves differently along different paths. This is not philosophical, it is measured. It is corrected for, it is used. If time were a background flow, clocks would simply read it off. They don't. They disagree. And when they do, physics sides with the clocks, not with your intuition. This already tells you something crucial. Space and time are not what you think they are because they do not exist independently of what happens in the universe. They respond. They participate. They are not containers. They are ingredients. Once you accept that, another illusion collapses quietly. The idea that there is a single, universal now. You think there is a present moment sweeping across the universe, slicing it cleanly into past and future. That picture is so deeply ingrained that questioning it feels absurd. Relativity makes it impossible. Two observers moving relative to each other do not agree on what events are happening right now. What you call present, another observer can legitimately call past or future. Both are correct. The laws of physics allow both descriptions. There is no preferred observer, no master clock, no cosmic present. This is not a technical detail. It is the foundation, which means the present is not a feature of the universe. It is a feature of your perspective. Once that is gone, the rest of what you thought you knew about time has nothing left to stand on. The belief that the past exists but the future does not relies entirely on the idea of a universal now. Without that, the distinction collapses. Physics never says the future is unreal. That idea came from how memory works. not from how the universe works. You remember the past. You don't remember the future. So the past feels solid, and the future feels empty. Physics does not confuse memory with existence. This is the same mistake people made when they thought the Earth must be stationary because it feels stationary, or when they thought matter must be solid because it feels solid. Feeling is not evidence of structure. In physics, events exist as points in spacetime, not because someone observed them, not because they are remembered, but because they are part of the structure described by the theory. Past, present, and future are not being created in sequence. They coexist as parts of a four-dimensional geometry. This is where people usually recoil, because they hear this and think it means nothing matters, or that free will is an illusion, or that life is predetermined. That reaction comes from importing the wrong metaphor. You imagine space-time as a finished movie, already filmed, already decided. That image is wrong. Space-time is not a script. It is a record. It includes your thoughts, your doubts, your decisions, your changes of mind. It does not skip the process. It contains it. From inside that structure, you experience uncertainty because you do not have access to future information. From outside the structure, uncertainty is not a property of existence. It is a property of knowledge. This distinction is the one you were almost never taught. You were taught that space is a container and time is a flow. You were taught that the present is special and the future is unreal. You were taught that physics somehow supports this picture. It doesn't. Physics quietly dismantles it and replaces it with something stranger and far more consistent, a universe where space and time are intertwined, dynamic, and inseparable from the things that exist within them. A universe where geometry replaces background, where perspective replaces absolutes. The universe is not what you think it is, because the way you think evolved to help you survive, not to describe space-time accurately. Physics is the slow process of discovering how wrong that intuition can be. Once you stop thinking of space as a container and time as a flow, a lot of familiar ideas suddenly start to wobble. The universe no longer looks like a place where things happen. It looks like a web of relationships, distances between events, durations between events, angles between world lines. Everything you thought was solid becomes relational. This is deeply uncomfortable, because relationships don't feel like things. You can't point to them. You can't hold them. But physics doesn't care what you can hold. It cares what can be measured. And what we measure are not objects floating in space over time. What we measure are events connected by space-time intervals. An event is something simple, a particle interaction, a clock tick, a flash of light detected by a sensor. Physics does not begin with objects. It begins with events. Objects are patterns in events, persistent correlations that fool you into thinking something solid is sitting there. Even the idea of there is suspect. When you say something is located somewhere, what you really mean is that certain events involving that thing are close together in spacetime. Location is not absolute. It depends on reference frames, motion, gravity, perspective. This is why the universe stubbornly refuses to give you a single, shared picture of reality. Two observers can describe the same situation in radically different ways, and both descriptions can be correct, not approximately. Exactly, this is not a bug, it is the core feature. You were taught that physics reveals how the world really is, as if there were a single, final image waiting to be uncovered. That expectation is part of the illusion. Physics does not give you a picture. It gives you rules for translating between perspectives. The universe is not made of things sitting in space as time flows past them. It is made of events connected by invariant relationships. The invariants are what matter. The rest is bookkeeping. Now consider how violently this clashes with everyday intuition. You feel like you are located at a point in space, moving forward through time. Physics says you are a world line, a curve through space-time. Your body is not something that persists through time. It is a sequence of events with strong correlations. You do not move through spacetime the way a marble moves through air. You are spacetime happening in a particular pattern. That sentence sounds abstract, until you realize it's the only description that survives careful measurement. Now let's talk about illusion, because that word tends to trigger resistance. People hear illusion and think not real. That's not what it means here. It means emergent. It means useful, but not fundamental. Space, as you experience it, is an illusion in this sense. It is a way your brain organizes sensory input. Time, as you experience it, is an illusion in this sense. It is a way your brain organizes memory and anticipation. These illusions are incredibly useful. You would not survive without them. But usefulness is not the same as truth. Physics is the discipline of finding out which parts of your experience are structural and which are conveniences. Space and time, in the everyday sense, turn out to be conveniences. This is why Feynman was always careful to separate what we can say from what we can picture. He understood that pictures are optional. Predictions are not. You can picture gravity as a force if you want. You can picture time as a river if you want. The universe will not stop you. But when you calculate, when you measure, when you test, those pictures quietly drop out. What remains is geometry and correlation. This is also why the universe feels so counterintuitive once you push beyond the human scale. Your intuitions were trained in a regime where space-time curvature is tiny, speeds are slow, and gravitational fields are weak. In that narrow regime, space looks flat and time looks universal. The illusions hold. Leave that regime, and they don't. Near massive objects, time slows. Space curves. Paths that look straight locally are not straight globally. Near light speed, simultaneity dissolves. Durations depend on motion. Distance depends on frame. None of this is optional. It is not interpretation. It is what the equations predict and what experiments confirm. So when you say, the universe is not what you think it is, what that really means is that the universe is not organized around the categories your mind prefers. It does not prioritize objects over events. It does not privilege now over then. It does not separate space from time. It does not care about your pictures. And here's the part people rarely notice. Once you let go of those pictures, the universe actually becomes simpler, not more complicated. You stop needing extra rules to explain why clocks disagree. You stop needing stories about forces reaching across empty space. You stop needing a cosmic present to hold reality together. You get one structure, spacetime, and one rule. Events are related by invariant intervals. Everything else follows. This does not make the universe less real. It makes it less anthropocentric. You are not the reference point around which space and time are organized. You are one trajectory among many. One perspective among many. Valid locally. Not globally privileged. This is the hardest thing to accept, because you have never experienced the universe from anywhere but inside your own head. But physics is precisely the act of stepping outside that limitation. Not physically, but conceptually. It tells you what must be true, even when it doesn't feel true. And what must be true is this. Space and time are not the scaffolding of the universe. They are part of its dynamics. They respond, they interact, they blur into each other. They do not exist independently of matter and energy. The universe is not a place where things happen. It is a set of happenings arranged in a structure that your mind approximates with space and time. That approximation works well enough to get you through the day. It does not work well enough to describe reality. Once you accept that space and time are not the backdrop of reality but part of its machinery, another assumption quietly collapses. The idea that the universe is made of things. You look around and you see objects, tables, stars, atoms. You assume those are the fundamental units of reality. Space is where they are. Time is when they change. Simple. Physics does not agree. At the most basic level, physics does not talk about things. It talks about interactions, about events, about fields that take values at points in space-time. An electron is not a tiny bead flying through empty space. It is an excitation of a field, a ripple in something that does not exist inside space and time so much as define them. This matters because it means the universe is not built out of little objects moving around in a big container. It is built out of relationships that persist. When you say an object exists, what you really mean is that there is a stable pattern of events that continues to show up in predictable ways. The object is the pattern, not a thing underneath the pattern. This is why objects blur when you look closely enough. The table you think is solid is mostly empty space. The atoms you think are tiny balls are probability clouds. The particles you think are points behave like waves, then like particles, then like neither. The universe keeps refusing to give you a comfortable layer where intuition can stop. And this refusal is not random, it is systematic. Every time you try to ground reality in something static and familiar, physics pulls the rug out from under it. You were taught that space is where objects are. Physics says space is a set of relationships between events. You were taught that time is what orders those events. Physics says time is part of the same structure as space, not a separate ordering mechanism. You were taught that objects persist through time. Physics says persistence is an approximation that holds only because certain patterns are stable. Even the idea of now, which feels so immediate and undeniable, turns out to be a local psychological construct. Your brain stitches together sensory input and memory into a coherent experience and calls it the present. Physics does not recognize it. This is why attempts to explain the universe using everyday language always end up smuggling in illusions. Language evolved to describe medium-sized objects moving slowly in weak gravity. It was never designed to describe spacetime geometry or quantum fields. Feynman understood this better than most. He knew that the hardest part of learning physics is not the math. It's learning to stop trusting the pictures that language suggests. When someone asks, "What is space made of?" or "Where is time flowing?" the honest answer is that the question is already broken. It assumes a framework that reality does not use. Space is not made of anything. Time does not flow anywhere. Those are leftover ideas from a picture that no longer works. Instead, you have a universe described by fields defined over spacetime, with dynamics encoded in equations that relate values at different points. Nothing moves through time the way you imagine it does. There is just correlation across the structure. This is also why the universe feels so strange when you push past everyday scales. At cosmological distances, space itself expands, not into anything, not through anything. The distances between events change because the geometry changes. At high speeds, time slows. Not because clocks malfunction, because the space-time interval along different paths has different lengths. Near massive objects, space curves. Paths that look straight locally are not straight globally. None of this fits into the container and clock picture you were taught. All of it fits perfectly into the space-time picture. The illusion was thinking the simpler picture was fundamental. And now comes the part that tends to provoke the most resistance. The idea that these illusions are not just mistakes about physics, but mistakes about how you locate yourself in the universe. You feel like a thing sitting in space, watching time pass. Physics says you are a process extended in space-time, a world line, a continuous chain of events. Your sense of being here now is not a window onto reality. It is a compression. Your brain cannot process a four-dimensional structure, so it collapses it into a moving three-dimensional snapshot. That snapshot updates, and you call the update time passing. Nothing is actually passing. This does not make experience fake. It makes it local. Your experience is real in the same way a map is real. It captures certain relationships accurately and ignores others. It is not the territory. The universe is not what you think it is. Because what you think evolved to help you survive, not to help you understand spacetime. Physics is the slow, uncomfortable process of discovering just how far those two goals diverge. And the deeper you go, the more consistent the message becomes. Reality is not built around human categories. It is built around mathematical structure, The closer you get to that structure, the less room there is for comforting pictures. What remains is not chaos, it is order of a very different kind. A universe made not of things, but of events, not of space and time as separate entities, but of spacetime. Not of a flowing present, but of relations that do not privilege now over then. The illusion was thinking the universe owed you an intuitive picture. It doesn't. At some point, if you follow this far enough, the universe stops feeling hostile to intuition and starts feeling indifferent to it. Not cruel, not mocking, just unconcerned. And that indifference is the final thing people struggle with, because it removes the last comforting idea. The idea that reality is supposed to make sense the way you naturally imagine it. It isn't. The universe is not obligated to line up with the categories your mind finds intuitive. Space and time feel obvious because your brain had to build fast, reliable shortcuts to survive. Those shortcuts work astonishingly well at human scales. They fail almost completely outside them. Physics is the record of those failures. Every major advance came from discovering that something we took for granted was an illusion. Absolute space, absolute time, solid matter, deterministic causation, each one felt foundational. Until it didn't. Each one dissolved, not because someone wanted it to, but because measurements forced the issue. Space and time are no different. You were taught that space is empty and time is universal because those ideas are good enough approximations to get through a day. They let you plan routes, meet deadlines, and predict motion well enough. They were never meant to be final descriptions. When you remove those approximations, what's left is not confusion. It's structure. The universe is a network of events related by invariant intervals. Those intervals don't care about your intuition. They don't care about your sense of now. They don't care about whether you imagine yourself moving through time or time moving past you. They just are. This is why physics keeps refusing to answer questions phrased in everyday language. What is space made of? Where is time flowing? What exists right now? These questions assume a framework that reality does not use. They are not deep questions. They are mismatched ones. Once you stop asking them, the universe becomes strangely coherent. Space is not a container. It is a set of relationships. Time is not a river. It is a coordinate. Objects are not fundamental. Patterns are. The present is not universal. It is local. And you are not a thing sitting in the universe watching it unfold. You are part of the unfolding pattern itself. That realization does not diminish you. It places you. You are a trajectory through space-time, a world line with memory in one direction and anticipation in the other. You experience change because information reaches you sequentially. You experience time because you are embedded in a structure you cannot see all at once. The universe is not hiding anything from you. It simply does not present itself in the way your brain prefers. Once you accept that, many fears evaporate. The fear that reality is meaningless because it is impersonal. The fear that losing intuitive space and time means losing grounding. The fear that not being central means not being significant. None of that follows. Significance is not something the universe assigns. It is something embedded systems generate locally, like you do. Physics was never meant to tell you what to value. It tells you how the world is structured, and that structure is far stranger and far more elegant than the picture you were handed. The universe is not a stage with props placed inside it. It is not a movie playing frame by frame. It is not a container with time dripping through it. It is a four-dimensional structure of relations, in which space and time are inseparable, dynamic, and dependent on what exists. The illusion was thinking there was something simpler underneath. There isn't. What there is instead is consistency. Measurements that agree across perspectives. Equations that work no matter who uses them. Predictions that hold even when they contradict intuition. Physics does not remove mystery. It removes false clarity. The universe is not what you think it is, because thinking evolved for speed and survival. not for understanding spacetime. The job of physics is to correct that mismatch, slowly, and often painfully. And once you let it, the correction feels less like loss and more like relief. You no longer have to force reality into a story it doesn't fit. You no longer have to protect intuition from evidence. You no longer have to pretend space and time behave the way they seem to. You can let the universe be what it is, not intuitive, not anthropocentric, not obligated to comfort you, just consistent. And that, in the end, is the most honest picture you're going to get.